Good evening and good morning for some of our members of the audience. Welcome back to the Henry George School for our panel on AI. This is the second panel on the same topic. And the title tonight is The Rise of Automation and AI, Blessing or Curse for the Working Class. Adaptation to technology-driven disruption has always been a key element that defined the growth of capitalist economies. So more than a century ago, we experienced the Industrial Revolution, and the mass adoption of machines led to tremendous labor displacement in the agricultural sector. But however, with those new opportunities, many more jobs were created, and workers easily transitioned from farm to factories and got better jobs. Productivity increased, wages got better, and society evolved in a right direction. So we've also experienced the same situation sometime around the 1980s with the introduction of computers at the workplace. So both of these changes took place without any of the gloomy scenarios predicted by skeptics and critics. So the question today is, with the introduction of AI and automation and the growing trend towards their adoption. So the question that we thought we answered, at least in a satisfactory way in the past, is now coming back. So the question now, the problem now is, are we prepared for what's coming? And what needs to be done, what kind of adjustment that needs to be done within society in terms of public policies in order to ride the wave. So joining us tonight to discuss this theme and to shed some light are three distinguished speakers. We gonna go by, I'm gonna name them by the order of the talks. We have Dr. Sandeep Sacheti, Executive Vice President of Kluwer, Wolters Kluwer. And we also have Dr. Ansel Schiavone, who is a professor of economics at St. John University, who will be, based on the discussion that I had with him right before the talk, will be looking at the question from the perspective of neoclassical economics. And last but not least, our in-house scholar, Dr. Edward, I would call him professor today because I think he deserved the title, Edward J. Dodson, faculty member of the Henry George School of Social Science, and he's also the host to our famed interview series known as Smart Talk. So without any delays, I'm gonna just let Sandeep take it over.
Oh, thank you, Brahma. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some of the thoughts that I have. And it's always good to be part of the academia, although I bring in a very commercial perspective, if you will. All my experience over the last 28 years has been in the industry. I do have a PhD, but that was eons ago. And I think I've forgotten all the economics that I learned in my PhD program. So with that, if you will, I am part of Wolters Kluwer, as Ibrahim was saying in his introduction of mine. And what I do at the company is I lead a function that is worth about 1,000 people spread across the globe that tries to understand the deep pain points of our financial and corporate customers from a compliance perspective. And we have experts in-house, lawyers, paralegals, etc., that actually read all the regulations that impact those industries and converts all of that knowledge into products utilizing AI that allow our customers to be compliant to the regulations that they're governed by. Yeah. So that's what we do. And we've been doing this for a number of decades in the company. Myself, I've been included and involved in this profession for about 12 years now. Yeah.
All I can tell David Cohen.
Now, as a company, Wolters Kluwer does something incredibly impactful and powerful. And we only serve professional customers globally. It's a 20,000 employee, employee base, serve customers in 180 countries, $5.5 billion of revenue. But we serve customers in specific professions, if you will: health, tax and accounting, finance and corporate compliance, legal and regulatory, and corporate performance, performance and ESG. And these professional customers, whenever they're making tough decisions, whether you are in front of your doctor and a doctor is determining what is the right course of action from a treatment perspective, they're utilizing our product. Or if you happen to be filing your tax returns in US or anywhere else, chances are that your accountant is utilizing our software to help you ensure that you are compliant to the tax regulations of the jurisdiction that you're part of. Or for a corporation, the fact that they need to be compliant to the legal requirements of their entity, again, we ensure that they are compliant to those regulations of the laws of the land. If you happen to be at a lawyer's office, chances are they're utilizing our software to guide you through your case. So you can see that each one of these verticals that we serve is of deep impact, and accuracy matters a lot. And we sit on massive amounts of data with deep understanding of our customers' pain points and what makes it important for them to serve every day. So as part of this exercise, we've been utilizing AI for about a decade already in the company. Nearly 50% of our revenue is one fashion or another touched by AI already. So I'm going to speak with that experience of serving our customers on an everyday basis with AI embedded across the patch of our organization in a very, very real manner, and what our experience has been in terms of impact to labor, because that's the topic at hand. So I'm going to actually reveal my, if you will, big takeaway. The demise of human labor and experts is greatly exaggerated. Now, I say this with past experience. I say it with what I see in future and what our current experience has been. So I'm going to divide my comments in just essentially three parts: lessons from the past, which are essentially history-driven, if you will, and learnings from our present experiences that we are seeing in the market today, and how are we preparing for the future so that labor and experts continue to play the main critical role in serving our customers. From the past, I got 3 points to make. First and foremost, we've been here before. And I think Ibrahim said it himself when he introduced this point of that when farm labor was moved over to industry, that transition was tough. But nevertheless, that transition did happen, and more jobs were created and lives were better off in the end. The transition, of course, is hard. You can look at the introduction of steam power, you can look at electricity, you can look at printing press. Each one of those were tectonic shifts, but every one of them eventually ended up creating a better society and a better outcome for labor. And more jobs were invented. And so there was a very recent interesting study by David Otter from MIT, and he looked at all the jobs that exist today. 60% of those jobs did not exist in 1940. So think about it. If you were sitting in 1940, you would not have imagined many of the jobs that we do today, and we consider them essential today. And hence, human beings are always creative, always figuring out what to do next and how to be inventive in adding value to society and adding value to ourselves, making lives better. The last point I would make is that while technology looks like it's going to have imminent impact and immediate impact, transitions are always slow. So I'll take an example of motor vehicle was introduced early 1900s, 1907 or something like that. It took about a decade before horses were replaced in cities. But it took nearly 40 years more before horses were replaced in the rural America. Transitions are just hard because it requires organizations to change the way they work. It requires customers to change the way they expect themselves to be served. A lot of infrastructure needs to be built. A lot of rewiring of society needs to be done. And therefore, transitions are generally far slower than we imagine them to be, which gives enough time for labor to migrate, learn new skills, and get ready for the next, if you will. Now let's look at the present. This is where we are today. And I'm already saying that AI has been around for a while for us, for most companies. And the best companies, including ourselves, we've been utilizing AI to drive efficiency for a long time now. This is not new news. And fortunately for us, because if you utilize AI smartly to drive efficiency, you utilize that efficiency gains to actually move up the value chain, reduce the mundane, and actually create inventions and innovations that our customers truly desperately need. Because the jobs to be done are far larger than what our human capacity today is or availability is. So this is the big challenge, then the conundrum that we all face is that the number of doctors that are needed, the number of nurses that are needed, the number of mental health professionals that are needed, you look at any profession and we just don't have enough of them. And society needs more and more of these served. And so in one respect, what we are finding is that thank God for some of the efficiency gains that AI is allowing us to create, because we need to do more for our customers, for the society that we are part of. So in fact, I am making a case for this is actually a good thing and a necessity for us to continue to thrive in society. Last but not the least is preparing for the future. So transformative change is coming. And I do believe that generative AI and AI in general is transformative. It is at the order of whether it's a steam engine or electricity, it may be even bigger than that. So it is imperative for companies like ourselves, institutions like Henry George and others to actually drive awareness, create education, and allow employees, labor, students to really practice and understand these new tools that are coming up. It is equally important for companies like ourselves to develop guardrails and principles as to what is ethical and what are the principles that we're going to stand behind. AI is not panacea if you just let it loose. But once you put in the right governance structures and once you put in the right principles in place, it actually can be good. So you have to think about transparency, you have to think about bias, you have to actually have principles around security, privacy, transparency, human in the loop. All of those things have to be part and parcel of your development practice. And so we've actually put in significant number of guardrails, as well as instituted these principles and educating our workforce on what are the ways to benefit from this new set of tools and how to leverage them smartly. And once you utilize those tools smartly and make them available to your labor across the organization, it enables them to drive internal transformation, reduces your friction, limits the capacity that we utilize for current offerings, and allows us to free up capacity and mindset for driving innovation. And that's what commerce is all about. And what I would also say is that while all of this is really exciting, technology continues to evolve. I don't think the final chapter on this technology evolvement has been written yet. Just yesterday, GPT-4o was released, and it is mind-blowing good. And think about it, it has no latency. So historically, previously, I say historically, literally, day before yesterday, when you ask ChatGPT a question, it would take several seconds before it would respond. And only a small, tiny percentage, less than 5% of the people actually end up paying for ChatGPT 4.0, which is 10x better than the 3.5, which was the free version. And now what has OpenAI done? They've made ChatGPT 4.40 completely free to everybody. And it's instantaneous response. It's conversational, it's multimodal to begin with. It's aware of the context you're part of. It can take photographs, it can take live video of where you are and take that into context as it's responding. Leaps and bounds better. And it's going to be available to everybody. So think about the innovation and the new, if you will, Cambrian explosion that is likely to happen with new thoughts coming into play on how to leverage these new capabilities. Even more impressive, AlphaFold 3 was released by Google literally just a few days ago, that actually now can accurately predict the structure of proteins, DNA, and RNA, and other things, and how they interact with each other. Imagine what will it do as a capability to allow us to truly understand biological systems and what it can do for drug discovery. Human lives are likely to be better off with these new technologies available to us. And yes, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and experts will still be needed to guide the development of these technologies and utilization of these technologies. So in the end, I remain exceptionally hopeful. And our history of world history, our company history, our professional history tells us that human labor is here to stay. And if anything, they're going to be doing more productive work, more innovative work, more impactful work. But we do need to learn and we do need to prepare, because for those people who do not prepare, this technology is going to come from left field. And unfortunately, transition for them will be much harder. So as a society, as a company, as a educational institution, I think the onus is on us to actually engage each other and our employees and our colleagues and our students to really get up to speed on what is the art of the possible and how to benefit from it in the most positive manner. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandeep. Now, our second speaker, Dr. Schiavone, will take it over.
Thank you for letting me speak there, and thank you again for having me. I'm happy to come back to this forum and speak in front of you folks. So my name is Ansel Schiavone. I'm an assistant professor at St. John's here in New York City, and today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit outside of my normal area of focus. But before I get started on that, I just wanted to share an update. So in the class that I teach at SJU, I run an activity where the purpose of the activity is to understand the relationship between the risk of automation and distribution. And so students are tasked with researching various occupations, finding out the average salary, and then coming up with an assessment of the degree of risk associated with automation of that particular occupation. And the result, I've run this exercise many times now, and the general result is that this is a negative relationship. And so therefore, higher earning jobs, these students assessed to be less at risk of automation. So these were the results of fall of 2022. And then, of course, prior to the release of ChatGPT, and then these are the results of spring of 2023. And what you can see, effectively is this shift among these high earning occupations, of which my students aspire to be. This is again reflecting kind of this fear that was brought on by the release of the technology earlier that fall. And I'm happy to share, or perhaps I'm happy to share, that the results from the most recent semester this past spring look a lot more similar to how they have been in the past. My assessment of this is that the initial fear of automation that kind of washed over everybody with the initial release has subsided in many ways, and students again seem to be fairly confident that the occupations that they seek to occupy in the future will still exist, albeit it's changed in some way. So I always think that it's interesting to listen to students, because they tend to have their fingers on the pulse, perhaps more than the rest of us in terms of where these technologies are headed. Okay, so now turning to the heart, or the heart of my presentation, I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. So if you know anything about me or my background, you will know that I'm not a neoclassical economist. In fact, I'm far from it. I was not trained as a neoclassical economist, nor do I have much sympathy for neoclassical theories of distribution, technology, and certainly not the efficient market hypothesis. However, over the past few months, I found myself writing a couple papers that are essentially theoretical critiques in one way or another of the neoclassical understanding of the relationship between technology and distribution. And I decided to kind of bring to this discussion essentially putting on the lens of these neoclassical economists, my colleagues at places such as MIT and Harvard. They're not really my colleagues. These are economists with much more influence and impact than myself. But to try to kind of introduce in a very simplified sense the way in which these neoclassical economists are likely thinking about these new technologies. And the reason I think that this is a useful exercise is because neoclassical economics is nothing if not optimistic, right? It tends to look at things through rose-tinted glasses. And so if we can look at the kind of the interpretation and the prediction that neoclassical theory gives us for the future, and we are concerned with that, then that should really serve as an indication that indeed we should be concerned with some of the dynamics that we are observing. So the disclaimer here is that I don't necessarily believe the theory that I'm about to present, but I think that it's a useful starting point, and of course it's at the heart of much of the high-level economic analysis. So we'll start, as any good neoclassical analysis does, with the production function. And so if you looked at this and your stomach began to churn, then let me say I feel you. And if your stomach didn't begin to churn, I would recommend seeing a psychologist, perhaps. This, of course, is the production function, right? The heart of macro neoclassical theory. And what the production function essentially tells us is that there is a mathematical relationship between capital and labor, the two inputs to production, and output denoted by a y. Right. Now, we have this particular form, which is known as the constant elasticity of substitution production function, which is sort of the most generalized form of the production function. We can get to the Cobb-Douglas or the Leontief production function through manipulation of these parameters. Now, we're not going to explore all of the intricacies of the CES production function, but I want to point out three important parameters that are going to be important to today's discussion. The first of these parameters is this value sigma, which is the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital. Now, this is a rather advanced economic concept, but I think that it's not so difficult to grasp in a basic sense. When we talk about substitutes, we're talking about two things for which the demand move in the same direction, right? So in opposite directions, if we're talking about substitutes. So Pepsi and Coke are substitutes. If the demand for one goes up, it is likely that the demand for the other will go down. And by contrast, complements are when the demand for those goods move in the same direction. So milk and cookies would be an example of complements. Now we are on the production side, not the consumer side, right? And so we were talking about capital and labor, denoted K and L respectively. And in the CES production function, if our elasticity of substitution is greater than 1, this implies that labor and capital are substitutes, that capital can be substituted for labor and vice versa. Whereas when sigma is less than 1, capital and labor are complements, right? That both capital and labor are used together, and therefore, if the demand for one increases, the demand for the other increases as well. So that is what this sigma value represents, and the key inflection point is greater or less than 1. Now, the question is, of course, what is in the macroeconomy, are capital and labor substitutes or complements? Well, I am fortunate to have not undertaken a research project of trying to answer this question, because it requires a lot of very complex theoretical and econometric approaches. But the general result that has been agreed upon within the neoclassical literature, because this is a purely neoclassical area of focus, is that the elasticity of substitution is likely less than 1, meaning that capital and labor, generally speaking, in the macroeconomy, are complements rather than substitutes. Now, that is our first parameter, so let's just keep that in the back of our mind, and I'll come back to this in a moment. But the second 2 parameters that we want to look at that have to deal with technical change or technology, which is the purpose of today's discussion, are these coefficients B and A. Now, what we have is this coefficient B being scaled by capital and the coefficient A being scaled by labor. And so what these reflect is how technical change is represented in the production function. So you can see if you have an increase in B, that effectively scales the amount of capital involved in the production process, right? It's an increase in the effective units of capital, whatever a unit of capital is. And similarly, an increase in A increases effective labor, right? The terminology that we can use for this, I say we, that neoclassical economists use for this, is that an increase in B is known as capital augmenting technical change, and an increase in A is known as labor augmenting technical change. Now, the question is, if we look back in history, well, is most technology, are most innovations capital augmenting or labor augmenting? And here we have a much higher degree of agreement both between neoclassical and non-neoclassical economists, and indeed Marx himself all would agree, all of these kind of disparate fields would agree that the vast majority of innovation over the past 200 years has been labor augmenting, in that it has increased the effective number of units of labor. So the example, a good example that is provided in Rousseau's paper is that if we imagine early manufacturing where all tools are powered by water or wind, that the invention of, or the advent of electricity would be a labor augmenting technical change, because it would allow for workers to now not have to be located near this source of water or source of wind, but rather be spread out throughout the workshop, thereby enabling the effective number of labor, or the effective units of labor to increase. So the general agreement in the literature is that most technical change is labor augmenting rather than capital augmenting. Okay, so when we think, or when neoclassical economists think about technical change, they think about it in this way: that technical change impacts one factor more than the other, that this technical change is unbalanced, that it is oftentimes unbalanced, and it is oftentimes labor augmenting versus capital augmenting. Now, that is kind of the technological side, right? That is, these are purely engineering concepts, right? In some kind of abstract way. These are all technical concepts. We haven't said nothing about the role of distribution. And so I want to introduce now the other side of this, the link towards how this output Y, GDP or income, is distributed within the economy. Now, the key variable, or the key variable, a key variable is the variable, the labor share, right? That gives us the percentage of total income, total GDP that is received by labor if we imagine that all income is either received by labor or capital, then the labor share is simply equal to 1 minus the capital share. An increase in the labor share is equivalent to a decrease in the capital share. Now, why is this relevant for distribution or for inequality? Well, this is where I always remind my students, and I use this helpful graph from Piketty, which I think is perhaps one of his most important graphs in his very large book. And that is, if we look at the source of income across the income distribution, we see that as we move towards the wealthier individuals, or as we move to the highest earning individuals in the economy, their income derived from capital is monotonically increasing. And as we approach the wealthiest or the highest earning members of society, those incomes are derived almost entirely from capital on average, right? So in other words, what this graph tells us is that an increase in the capital share or a corresponding decrease in the labor share is going to exacerbate inequality. It is going to represent a transfer from low earners to high earners because of the underlying distribution of capital within the economy. Okay, so this is the variable of interest, the labor share, and we're interested in how technology influences the labor share, right? But the mechanism whereby this influences inequality or impacts inequality is by the underlying distribution of capital amongst the population. Now, to understand the neoclassical, the mathematics behind how we go from this connection of these parameters of the labor share or parameters of the production function and the impact on the labor share, well, I won't bore you with all the math and the detail, but we have essentially 4 possibilities. Because technical change can be either labor augmenting or capital augmenting, and because capital and labor can be either complements or substitutes, it gives us 4 possibilities. And what we'll see, and I'll cut to the chase just for the sake of time, is that according to the empirics and observations from history, we have it that capital and labor are complements to each other, and technical change has been overwhelmingly labor augmenting. And in such a situation, we have it that technical change is capital bias. Right? What that means is that this technical change, this increase in A, under the condition of complementarity between capital and labor, results in a shift in income towards capital and away from labor. Now, the way we can conceptualize this, or this example of the factory that is suddenly electrified, well, the idea is that the effective units of labor has been multiplied by the fact that there is now electricity. And so now there is greater demand for capital, there is greater demand for tools, and that results in capital deepening. And that greater demand for capital results in higher rewards for capital relative to labor, thereby increasing the capital share and reducing the labor share. That is the simple, beautiful mechanism of the neoclassical theory of distribution, right? Now, when faced with phenomena such as a declining labor share, such has been the case in the United States over the past 60 years, well, the answer, according to the neoclassical economist, is simple, right? The explanation of this graph here is simply that technical change has been labor augmenting, but because capital and labor are complements to each other, this has resulted in higher demand for capital and therefore higher compensation of capital relative to labor, right? That is the neoclassical explanation for labor share decline. Now, do I believe this explanation? Absolutely not, right? This flies in the face of history and ignores many of the institutional changes that have occurred, all of the institutional changes that have occurred over the past 60 years that likely explain this trend much better than changing technology. However, I want to continue in this thought experiment just one step further and ask the question, now that we are educated neoclassical economists, what do we think about AI, right? What do our friends at MIT and Harvard, Asimoglu and David Autor, et cetera, what do they think about the implications of AI for distribution? Well, the implications are simple, right? To get our answer, we only have to answer 2 questions. The first is, will capital and labor remain complements? Will it be the case still that both capital and labor are incorporated into the production process together to create output, or are they going to become more substitutes? Now, my personal answer for this, and this is now me just projecting because I have no idea what's going to happen in the future, is that I find that it's very unlikely. I believe it would be very unlikely to believe that there would be some dramatic change in the relationship between capital and labor in terms of them being complements, particularly in an economy that is increasingly service-based, right? A thing about services is that it tends to be much more complementary in nature, labor and capital, as opposed to substitutive. So if our answer to question number one is that labor and capital remain complementary, the last question that we have to ask is, well, will AI be predominantly labor or capital augmented, right? Was it going to increase A, where it multiplies the effective units of labor, or will it increase B, where it multiplies the effective units of capital? Well, again, I don't know what the future holds, but the fact that is the AI is the abbreviation for artificial intelligence leads me to believe that it is indeed going to continue to be labor augmenting in terms of its capacity. So given these kind of preliminary answers to these two questions, the result, according to the neoclassical theory, therefore, would be that we would see a continuation of a decline in the labor share, rising inequality, and shifting income from labor to capital. Again, this is from the optimistic perspective of the neoclassical hypothesis, the efficient market hypothesis, and the neoclassical theory of distribution. This says nothing of the fact that these technologies clearly exhibit increasing returns to scale, which naturally leads to the creation of monopoly. It says nothing of the impact that this will have in labor markets of undermining worker power. It says nothing of conflict of institutions, nothing outside of kind of the neatly packaged neoclassical framework. So that is not the way that I think about the world, but it is the way that many economists think about the world. And I think it's important that non-economists know how economists think about the world. And I think that it is revealing both in terms of the predictions and also the underlying assumptions. So I will stop there and turn it over to our next panelist.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schiavone, for such a fantastic presentation. Dodson.
Well, the two of you have really set out a very aggressive set of issues for me to try to comment on and respond to and then question you about before we turn this over to the participants here to join in on the discussion. As Sandeep, as you were talking, and even as Ansel was talking, I was thinking about the British television series Connections from back in the late 1970s. I don't know if you remember James Burke, who was a science historian, and he produced this series of programs called Connections, and then another series called The Day the Universe Changed. And
it's something that I have missed, and I will put it on my must-watch list now.
It seems like it would be great for him, if he's still around, to do an updated series on that incorporates all the changes that have occurred, since the early 1980s, for example. But a lot of it seems to be relevant to this immersion of artificial intelligence into our world. Now, Sandeep, you're talking about how you believe the work of firms such as yours, which are intelligence-based and require highly knowledgeable, skilled people involved, how that will affect future employment and rewards in the labor market, et cetera. A couple things I was thinking about were the demographics, not just of the United States population, but of the population of many countries. Our demographics is aging.
Yes.
Those, generally speaking, in any society where women have an opportunity for education and status outside of motherhood, they tend to have fewer and fewer children during their childbearing ages. How do you two see that as affecting the future and in terms of the issues that you're concerned about?
No, thank you for the question. And I really, that's one of the premises that I made in terms of the jobs to be done, the problems to be solved, the needs of society are increasing, whether it's doctors, lawyers, accountants, or you want to solve climate change problems, you want to solve world hunger, you want to solve any of the situations, and they're only getting exacerbated with the aging population and the young not getting, or rather the population decline, if you will. So where is that human labor going to come from? Well, part of that is substitution with AI and generative AI, but even that requires human beings to train them, human beings to monitor them, human beings to establish rules and governance principles to ensure that they react and become useful to us. So in my mind, I think the needs are far larger, and AI is essential to essentially make sure that we continue down the path of a positive trajectory for society.
And what does economics have to say to us about the changing demographics? And even though the rate of population increase is at zero in some countries and falling in others and still growing in others, we have a large human footprint on this planet. If we're going to peak at somewhere between 8 and 9 billion people, what does economics have to say to us about this transition from labor orientation to capital orientation? Ansel's on. He's muted.
Apology, I won't mute myself again. Yeah, demographics is it's really an area of interest and of mine. I'm afraid I can't answer your question for the entirety of the field, but I can just mention a couple of the ways that I think about it in my work. One that comes to mind, this discussion of falling fertility in rich countries that is, some fact or some function of income, right? Of GDP per capita is a pretty good, it's pretty strongly correlated. I think that it's also interesting to look at that within a particular economy. I'm working on a paper right now that deals with questions of inheritance. And, if we look back at census data from the late 1800s in the United States, there's I was trying to pull it up on my computer here. There's a very strong positive relationship between the number of children that a household would have and the total wealth of that household, right? That relationship was positive. And of course, sometime during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, that relationship flipped. And there is now a negative relationship between wealth and the number of children born among the baby boomer generation. The baby boomer generation is the first to exhibit that negative relationship between wealth and fertility. And I think one interesting thing to note, one distributional consequence that has, is that as you have an aging population, what you have is larger transfers of wealth from older individuals to a smaller cohort, a younger cohort. That's the way that wealth is transferred. And when you have a negative relationship between fertility and wealth, what that means is that larger inheritances are being passed to smaller numbers of heirs, right? So it actually has a concentrating effect. And this can be measured. It increases the Gini coefficient by 3 or 4 percentage points, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a significant increase. That is at least a decade's worth of increase in the Gini coefficient for wealth that is purely explained by that fertility differential. That is within the United States. But of course, the thing I would say that the unknown variable is that, well, the world's population is still growing, right? On an aggregate, is still growing. And so I think that the question of falling birth rates, it's as much a political question as it is an economic question, right? We talk about capital and labor mobility, and the neoclassical framework likes to assume perfect mobility in both. The reality is that capital sprints around the world at the click of a button, and labor has to come on boats or by train or whatever it might be, right? So I think, and nobody can really predict the future of the politics of immigration and things like that, but that's going to be very critical. I mean, that's something that watch closely, because that will have major implications for things such as Social Security and economic prosperity in countries like the United States.
How does artificial intelligence affect our individual initiative? In other words, is it particularly among those right now who largely use their physical labor to make a living? I mean, even someone who drives a truck today is now thinking about the possibility of their career ending because technology is going to make those trucks drive from location to location without a driver. And so you get a portion of our population that is in an age where their ability to learn new skills in a short enough time to keep their income level up, that suggests to me that there's a real social problem as artificial intelligence makes its way into other areas of our economic system. How do you see that, Ansel, and how do you see that, Sandeep, from both a ability of our societies to adapt and the threats to the kinds of democratic processes that are involved in how we make decisions about public policy?
So it's such a complicated question, but let me give you a little bit of a historical thought, if you will. So for close to 100,000 years, human beings perfected human language, and we became really good at communicating with each other and getting, expressing love, expressing our emotions, getting work done through human language. And about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, somebody said, oh, you really need to start talking in a very different language because we need to utilize computers too. And so we had to learn a very different language, call it BASIC, Fortran, Pascal, to COBOL, to now Python, etc. And a very small number of people are able to converse in that language. Vast majority of the population is unable to benefit from computers today at the maximum level because they don't speak the language of that ecosystem. What generative AI is doing is allowing every single human being to be able to benefit from this powerful set of computers out there to converse in a language that they have already perfected for a millennia. So in some respect, it is freeing, it is enabling, it is egalitarian in that respect of everybody, whoever has an idea, whoever has enterprise can actually set up a company tomorrow at a very low cost of entry with no extra knowledge of computer science or anything and actually get going. And you can see that in statistics also. New enterprise establishment in US is higher than ever. There's a reason, because the barrier to entry and establishing a company is now lower and lower because you don't need a high infrastructure expense. You don't need to learn new skills. You can actually utilize your existing skills with existing tools that you already have to get going, if you will. So in my mind, it's actually really positive.
It just occurs to me, I don't know if this statistic is true, but from past reading about the failure of new startups, generally, what is it? 1 out of 2 fail within the first 3 years. Do you think that artificial intelligence means that failure rate will drop or has already started to drop?
I don't know. That's a good one. I have not looked at that, so I can't comment on it from a factual perspective. It may be too early to tell, but it's a numbers game. So even if it remains 1 out of 2, however, if 100 enterprises were getting formed previously, 50 would survive after 3 years. Well, now 1,000 are getting germinated, 500 will survive. So even if the ratio remains the same, it just has a better outcome from an impact perspective of the overall society. So my point is that it's just easier to establish.
Ansel, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Well, I was thinking, no, because I was thinking about your earlier question,
Okay.
with the, the relationship of automation or fear of automation and demographics or fertility decisions. Obviously, nobody can say why a person makes their fertility decisions, but I think that on average, what we can say is that historically speaking, if we look at the data, that people's fertility decisions are influenced by positive economic factors. That is, my perception is that people deciding to have fewer children, say in the modern context, has been a function of of higher income, right? That people are delaying having children because they're in school and maybe they're getting a graduate degree and they want to be established in their career. And of course, some have pointed to the fact that maybe it's also just a rise in general prosperity that people, as well as a sense of individualism, that people decide simply not to have children. So I think that in terms of that being a function, that being the driving force for why you see people, having fewer children, I think that is probably more of a function, a factor, as opposed to fertility decisions born out of economic fear. I'm not sure. I'm just speculating, but I would be. Yeah, I'm not sure. And of course, the reality with fertility decisions is you can't know until until later whether those decisions have been acted upon. And so ChatGPT has been out now for more than 9 months, so I don't know, maybe we are in the middle of a baby bust, but I sort of doubt it, or at least for that reason, I sort of doubt it.
Before I bring in questions from the participants for those who are attending here, and so let me ask you a very pointed question about economic theory, and answer this as a critic of neoclassical economics and not as a neoclassical scholar. But when you talk about labor and capital, those of us who are schooled at the Henry George School, we get very upset by the failure of economists to distinguish between capital goods, tangible capital goods that are produced by labor, from nature, with tools and machinery, etc., and finance capitalism. And this seems to be, in our mind, a great failure on the part of neoclassical economic theory. Do you have any thoughts on that yourself as a critique of neoclassical theory?
Of course, I agree. I think that if you're familiar with the Cambridge controversy, the whole point is that if we require the price of capital to be able to determine or to be able to measure a quantity of capital, then of course that creates a circular logic. And so I'm very sympathetic. In fact, I have to do, when I am working through these papers, a significant amount of mental gymnastics to understand, or of abstraction, I should say, to really think about what a unit of capital actually is. And I think from a more another perspective, this is a point that Kaldor made, that the neoclassical belief or interpretation of the entrepreneur is a neutral individual that employs both labor and capital as inputs to production to produce something, right? As opposed to the classical and Marxian interpretation that it is the capitalist, him or herself, that is responsible for determining, how the interaction of labor and capital will occur in production, right? I mean, that is the way that I see the world, but of course, that's harder to write down in equation form, I guess. And so that's perhaps part of the reason why the marginalists seem to have dominated for the past 100 years, is that it's easier to write their theory on a whiteboard.
So before I let you go on that, what implications does that have for public policy in your mind?
Well-
What should be our appropriate public policy with regard, let's say, to the taxation of capital goods, tangible capital goods versus gains on the sale of financial instruments?
Well, I recognize the underlying the relationship to Mr. George, but I teach this in my class as well. You know, the reality that, you know, in terms of income, labor is taxed heavier than capital, and when it comes to you know, taxation of wealth, insofar as it occurs in the United States, it is a tax on physical capital, right? You know, financial capital, of course, is somehow exempt from that, right? Because it is a tax on wealth, but it's only a tax on, you know, the wealth of the middle class, or at least it's a disproportionate tax on the middle class. So I don't know if that gets me in trouble or gets me points.
Fair enough.
That's my interpretation, is that the picking and choosing of types of income and types of capital leads to more regressive outcomes than we probably intended.
So we would like to thank our panelists for very enlightening discussion. And we want to thank also everybody for participating. And we look forward to seeing you soon at the Henry George School. Good night.
Thanks so much.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.